One of the more rare and unusual locomotives to be produced by the electromotive division of GM, or EMD, was the F45 series of locomotives. While the F45 was based upon EMD's troublesome but successful ST45, it has its own unique story that is definitely worth a closer look. The origins of this series of locomotives can be traced back to the mid-1960s. The Santa Fe Railroad specifically was short of reliable motive power to haul its passenger trains. The main culprit was the age of the company's passenger hauling locomotives. Aging EMD F units that could trace their heritage all the way back to the early 50s, and even a few Alco PAs which were quickly being retired, whose own heritage went all the way back to the late 1940s just after the end of World War II. It should be noted that the Alco PAs were being retired in spite of a last-ditch effort of rebuilding these handsome beasts with EMD prime movers. The Santa Fe was also a very proud railroad and considered its passenger trains its calling cards, and would certainly not want to subject its passengers to frequent breakdowns and/or delays and other such inconveniences caused by older unreliable equipment. The increased maintenance costs on these aging locomotives wasn't exactly helping things either, as by this point in history, passenger trains were no longer very profitable, if at all, and higher maintenance only drove the losses that much higher up. The Santa Fe had a fondness for its Alco PA passenger hauling locomotives, and even went to the extreme, as mentioned before, of putting a few of them through an extensive rebuild with EMD prime movers to get them back into service. The 6 axles made these engines specifically good on steep grades and gave the crew who drove the locomotives a very smooth ride. These and other such factors would motivate the Santa Fe to look for a 6-axle design to replace its passenger locomotives. GE at the time was offering great deals on old Alco equipment in terms of trade-in value, and with several Alco PAs to trade in, the Santa Fe decided to give them a shot. The first model GE would come up with and would be purchased by the Santa Fe was called the U28CG. Rated, as its name implies, at 2,800 horsepower and equipped with 6-axle trucks, the locomotive was little more than a U28 with a steam generator added to the rear. While these locomotives, at least in their initial stages, would do their job very respectably, the Santa Fe was never quite satisfied with their looks. They lacked the streamlining of the F units and the Alco PAs they were replacing. The lack of streamlining also contributed to lack of efficiency and thus made them more expensive to operate at speed. Rough, not smoothened out surfaces and squared off sharp edges tend to grab air more effectively at higher speeds, thus slowing the locomotive down and/or requiring more power for the locomotive to maintain or increase its speed. With the trade-in policy still in place for Alco locomotives by GE, and the Santa Fe, at least in the initial stages, being impressed with its U28C's performance, would inspire the Santa Fe to go back to GE for another order of passenger locomotives, in this case rated at 3,000 horsepower and known as the U30CGs. Unlike the U28CGs, these particular locomotives differ drastically in that they had a very beautiful streamlined cab and cowling and were otherwise full-bodied for better wind resistance, as well as looks. These particular locomotives were ordered manufactured in 1967 and were delivered in November of that year and put into service shortly thereafterward. These locomotives' careers as passenger locomotives on the Santa Fe would come to an abrupt end just 2 years later, when one of these particular locomotives hauling the Grand Canyon Limited between Chicago and Los Angeles derailed. Unfortunately for GE and the Santa Fe alike, the design of both the U28CG and U30CGs was suspect to causing the derailment, causing all of these engines to immediately be pulled from passenger service, and thus the aging F units, which had almost been sent to the scrapper, were promptly pulled from the deadline and put back into service hauling passenger trains. Luckily, the Santa Fe had decided not to put all of its eggs in one basket, and had already ordered another type locomotive to attempt to replace its passenger engines. It would be built by EMD, and based upon EMD's most recent locomotive, the SD45. It would be known as the FP45, F standing for full length, and P standing for passenger, and 45 standing for the family and/or series the locomotive belonged to. The first order of FP45s would be delivered to the Santa Fe a month later than the U30CGs. This is an interesting if not shocking fact, as EMD was in the best position to provide the Santa Fe with a passenger hauling locomotive, as it already had a locomotive that met most of the Santa Fe's specifications in production, called the STP45. It generated 3,600 horsepower, the same as an SD45, and provided most of the features the Santa Fe was looking for, including a 6-axle truck arrangement. Unfortunately, there was one catch. The SDP-45 was essentially an SD-45 with a slightly extended body to house a steam generator and with some slight regearing. It looked every bit like a utilitarian freight locomotive. This is a problem as the Santa Fe wanted a cowl/streamlined locomotive for improved looks, as again the Santa Fe marketed its passenger trains as its calling cards, as well as efficiency at speed, with the streamlining offering more fuel savings at higher speeds that the passenger trains would travel at. One could certainly be forgiven if they thought that the FP45's body was in fact structural. The fact was, this was strictly a body kit, but it did serve a purpose. By streamlining the appearance of the locomotive, not only made it more pleasurable to look at, but also improved, as mentioned before, the efficiency at speed, allowing a fuel savings of somewhere around 30% over a standard SD-45 at these speeds. The Santa Fe would buy 9 of these locomotives, while the Milwaukee Road, seeing the success the Santa Fe had had and needing passenger locomotives of its own, decided to purchase 5 of them for itself. While the Santa Fe and Milwaukee Road FP45s look close to identical, there is one critical difference, as unlike the Santa Fe, the Milwaukee Road units lack dynamic brakes. For the most part, the FP45s proved to be quite reliable, despite being based upon the rather infamous 645E3 V20 prime mover that EMD had used in the SD45 and it had so many chronic issues with, including crankshaft failures and cracked blocks. The main reason for these issues had to do with EMD rushing the locomotive into production in order to keep up with the horsepower race, which all the major United States locomotive manufacturers were involved in at that time. But again, and luckily for EMD, the FP45 did not seem to suffer many of these issues, although there were some similar problems that did occur. While only a total of 14 of the FP45s were produced, they still managed to make a profit for EMD. This is because the FP45 was largely based upon the SDP-45, with the simple addition of the cowl body added to it, which again was not structural. The looks of the FP45 would further inspire the Santa Fe to order a similar type locomotive for hauling freight. Referred to as the F45, it was essentially an SD45 with a full-length cowl body, mainly for looks and for streamlining again. The F45 would relaunch Santa Fe's utilization of cowl locomotives to haul its freight trains. These locomotives would also be painted in the famous Santa Fe war bonnet, which the company had introduced in the 1950s. This first order of locomotives would go out in 1968 for the Santa Fe. The next order of locomotives for the Santa Fe, however, would be delivered in the famous blue bonnet freight colors. Other railroads would become interested in acquiring F45s for themselves, but not necessarily for the same reason as looks as the Santa Fe had. Let's take the Great Northern's order for these locomotives for an example. The Great Northern operated a lot of treacherous tracks through the Rocky Mountains, exposing the crews to sub-zero temperatures as well as very harsh weather conditions. To help protect crews in these conditions, specifically a situation in which the locomotive would develop a minor mechanical problem that would need to be fixed by going into the prime mover area itself, the full cowl body would protect the crew from the elements, allowing them to access the prime mover, instead of in normal circumstances where the prime mover on normal locomotives would have no such convenience for the crew and require them to walk outside and access the prime mover via doors. This can be very difficult with treacherous weather conditions, if not impossible. The Great Northern would initially order 6 of these units. However, after finding itself highly satisfied with the first order of 6, it would double the order to 12. The second order, however, would wind up under Burlington Northern control as the GN, or Great Northern, was merged into the Burlington Northern system at that time. The Burlington Northern, again satisfied with these engines, would make an additional order for an additional 20 units. Several of the Santa Fe units would be involved in a rebuild program at the San Bernardino shops, which would have them re-engined with much more reliable prime movers from the Dash 2 series, as well as other upgrades. After their rebuilds, these engines would be redesignated as SD F45s. The final chapter of the F45 story comes from a locomotive that, while it looked just like an F45, wasn't known as an F45, nor did it actually produce the same amount of horsepower, only 3,000. It was referred to as an SDP-40F. These models were produced specifically for Amtrak during its early years as a replacement for the aging E&F units it had inherited from other railroad companies at the time, when it assumed responsibility for the majority of American passenger trains. The reason for this locomotive being known as an SD rather than an FP, despite the fact that it had a full-length cowl body, is quite interesting. EMD had been under price controls for the F45 series, and so if it had named this locomotive with an F40 or 45, it would have had to have submitted to the government's price controls on these particular models, and thus the locomotive was known instead as an SDP-40F. As the 40 in the locomotive's name implies, the locomotive had the smaller 16-cylinder prime mover from the SD-40, generating 3,000 horsepower even. It was also equipped with two massive steam boilers, which were in turn supplied by two massive water tanks. It was these features that actually led to this locomotive's downfall, as it was found that many of these locomotives experienced derailment problems when traveling on the Santa Fe and other such railroads, coming around curves. The water would apparently smack against the actual tanks in curves due to the centrifugal force, causing the locomotive's center of gravity to shift. This situation was further aggravated by the fact that these water tanks were mounted high in the locomotive, which had a more drastic effect on the locomotive's center of gravity, causing many of the derailments these engines would suffer, which would eventually lead to this locomotive being banned from most United States railroads. The retirement of the FP45s from mainline service would go largely unlamented by the crews that operated this locomotive, as they found that the FP45 rode very rough, especially compared to the E units and F units that it replaced. The end result was a rather deja vu moment again, where Amtrak had to pull all of its old E and F units from the deadline and place them back into active service, just like the Santa Fe had done several years earlier with its GE passenger units for the same reason. Many of these locomotives would be traded into EMD for new F40PH type locomotives, which is a smaller type engine which Amtrak had originally considered for small to medium trips, but would end up serving the company very well as its new long-distance railroad locomotive, and essentially would become an all-around workhorse for the company, pulling pretty much every kind of train the company had to offer for quite some time, with the notable exception of the Northeast Corridor, which was electrified. This whole event would also speed up the upgrading of the old heritage fleet, that is to say the vintage passenger cars the company inherited from other railroads when it started operations in '71, to head-end power, where the locomotive itself would provide electricity to heat the cars, and the complete and total elimination of the actual steam boilers and steam heating systems altogether. The F40s would use largely all the main components from the SDP-40S with the exception of the body. This included the prime movers, generators, traction motors, and the majority of the electrical components for these devices. While this was the fate of most of the SDP-40Fs, it wasn't the fate of all of these engines. Some were traded to the Santa Fe for light-duty switcher units, such as CF7s, which were essentially F units rebuilt as road switcher locomotives, or SSB 1200s, which were rebuilt SW 1200 locomotives. The locomotives once introduced on the Santa Fe line were given a lot of concrete ballast to help overcome the massive issues with the top heaviness, and the steam boiler and passenger equipment was all removed. These units also received front and back platforms to ease boarding of the locomotive, especially during switching moves. Also, they received steps in place of their ladders, although these steps were difficult to climb. The units were then redesignated by the Santa Fe as SDF-40-2s. The 18 of these units traded to the Santa Fe for these light-duty switchers lasted in service until 2002, when the final one was finally retired. The F45 series of locomotives by GM definitely was a unique series of locomotives that definitely stuck out like sore thumbs, especially against EMD's own SG series and GP series of locomotives, which it was producing at that time. While few of these locomotives remain in existence to this day from the various different CRI that they were produced, they still have managed to make a noticeable mark on the history of American railroading. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe as it will help me greatly. And thank you very much again for watching. And as always, keep the metal side down.